Strength often lies hidden in the most unassuming places, waiting for the right moment to emerge. In a bustling city repair shop, this truth would come to life on an otherwise ordinary night. What began as a brazen attempt by a gang to intimidate and rob the owner of a repair business would spiral into a confrontation that dismantled their dangerous operations. None of the gang members could have imagined that a quiet, homeless drifter was a former Special Forces operative with years of combat expertise and would come to the man's rescue. Hell-bent on revenge, their arrogance would cost them dearly. Their plans of domination would crumble, their members would be humiliated, and they would face the justice they had long evaded. This isn't just a story of a skilled veteran protecting what's right. This is about how one man's quiet courage, paired with the resilience of a determined business owner, brought down a gang that had terrorized the city and proved that determination and integrity can turn the tide against even the most ruthless oppressors. Before we go any further, comment where in the world you are watching from, and make sure to subscribe. Andre Phillips leaned against the wall of the alley, arms crossed, his eyes scanning the scene in front of him. The late afternoon sun cast jagged shadows across the cracked pavement, and the distant hum of traffic filled the air. From where he stood, Andre could see the street clearly, the people passing by, the shifting rhythm of life he no longer felt part of. He liked this spot because it gave him just enough cover to observe without being noticed. A man walked down the sidewalk, brisk but unhurried. White guy, mid-40s, dressed plainly in a worn jacket. He looked like the kind of man who worked hard, someone who didn't belong in a neighborhood like this. Andre frowned, watching the man head straight toward a group of young men gathered near the corner. Trey Malone stood at the center, his voice carrying easily over the low buzz of the street. He was tall, with a swagger that announced he owned the block. Behind him, Rico and Sean flanked him, their postures lazy but ready. Dante lingered a step behind, quieter than the others, but still part of the pack. "Yo, you're the guy with the repair shops, right?" Trey's voice cut through the air, loud enough for Andre to hear. The man slowed, his expression tightening. "Yeah, what's it to you?" Trey stepped forward, his grin sharp and dangerous. "We've been meaning to talk to you." "Business is good, huh?" Andre sighed and pressed back against the wall. He didn't need to hear the rest to know where this was going. He'd seen it 100 times before. Guys like Trey always started with words, building to something worse. Andre's gut twisted, but he stayed rooted. "Not my fight," he reminded himself. "It's fine," the man said, his voice firm but calm. "I don't need anything from you." Rico laughed. "See, that's the thing. You don't know what you need until someone tells you." Sean stepped closer, tilting his head. "You're doing good, man. Real good. But this is our block, and we take care of people. Call it insurance." Andre's fists tightened, his jaw clenching as he watched the man stand his ground. The guy didn't look scared, but Andre could see the tension in his stance, the way his hands stayed close to his sides. He was thinking about how to get out of this. Problem was, Trey and his crew weren't going to make it that easy. "I'm not interested," the man said, his voice sharper now. "Step aside." Trey's grin dropped, and his eyes hardened. "That's not how this works, man. You don't walk away until we're done talking." Andre exhaled slowly, his breath fogging in the cool air. He knew the next move would come any second. Trey's type always pushed until they got what they wanted, or until someone pushed back. For a moment, Andre's fingers twitched at his sides. The urge to intervene gnawed at him, but his feet stayed firmly planted. "Listen," the man said, his tone dropping into something more threatening. "I don't know who you think you are, but you're not getting a damn thing from me." The silence that followed was heavy, like the world was holding its breath. Rico leaned forward, a smirk spreading across his face. "You got a mouth on you, huh? Let's see how tough you really are." Andre shook his head, muttering to himself, "Walk away, man. Just walk away." But Daniel didn't. He stood his ground. Andre shifted against the wall, his hands shoved deep into his coat pockets. The tension in the air thickened as the men closed in around the white guy. "Daniel," he'd heard someone call him. Andre could see the man stiffen, his jaw tightening as Trey stepped into his space. "You're making this harder than it has to be," Trey said, his grin turning razor-sharp. "Let's keep it simple. Empty your pockets." Daniel crossed his arms, refusing to back down. "I told you, I'm not giving you anything. Go find someone else to bother." Rico let out a low whistle. "Ooh, tough guy. You hear that, Trey? He thinks he's got options." Andre's gut churned as Sean leaned closer, his hand reaching toward Daniel's chest. Daniel swatted it away, but Trey laughed, his amusement filling the alley like a bad smell. "Man, you've got guts. Stupid, but gutsy," Trey said, shaking his head. He gestured to Rico. "Help our friend here loosen up." Before Daniel could react, Rico shoved him hard, slamming him against the wall. The sound echoed down the alley, sharp and jarring. Daniel grunted, but he didn't go down. "Back off!" Daniel snapped, shoving Rico away. His voice was strong, but Andre could hear the strain in it. Trey sighed dramatically, spreading his arms. "See? Now you're making us look bad. We're just here to help. Why you gotta be so ungrateful?" Sean snickered and stepped forward, grabbing the front of Daniel's jacket. "Come on, let's see what you've got." Andre watched as Daniel's hands flew up, trying to push Sean off. His resistance only seemed to encourage them. Rico joined in, patting Daniel's sides mockingly before slipping a hand into his pocket. "Hey, look at this!" Rico pulled out a leather wallet, holding it up like a prize. "Man's been holding out on us. Give that back!" Daniel lunged for the wallet, but Trey's fist shot out, catching him in the stomach. The air rushed out of Daniel's lungs, and he stumbled, his hand clutching his side. "Look at him," Sean said, laughing. "Thought he was gonna scare us off." Andre's fists tightened, his nails digging into his palms. He didn't want to get involved, but watching the man get beaten down sparked something deep in his chest. The scene played out too familiar. Helplessness, powerlessness, the same things that had haunted him for years. Daniel struggled to straighten, his voice hoarse. "You think this makes you men? Jumping someone 3-on-1? Trey's smirk widened. "Man, you're lucky we're feeling generous. Could have been worse." Andre's breath quickened, his heart pounding in his chest. He was still in the shadows, his body frozen between instinct and doubt. "Not my fight," he told himself again. "Not my problem." But Daniel didn't stop fighting. Even as they shoved him back against the wall, rifling through his pockets, he kept struggling, throwing weak punches that only made them laugh harder. Rico pulled a handful of cash from Daniel's wallet, waving it in the air. "Dinner's on him tonight, boys." The laughter grated against Andre's ears. His jaw clenched so hard it hurt. He pressed himself against the wall, forcing himself to stay rooted. It wasn't his fight. It wasn't. Then Trey raised his fist again, aiming for Daniel's face. Andre's breath hitched. He felt his body tense, the old instincts firing in his veins. The man's muffled groan echoed in the alley, breaking something inside Andre. He cursed under his breath. His feet moved before his mind could stop them, carrying him out of the shadows. Andre's shoulders pressed back against the brick wall, his eyes narrowing as the gang's mockery turned crueler. Daniel struggled to steady himself, his hands gripping the edge of the wall for support. Trey stood over him, smirking, as Rico and Sean rifled through his belongings like vultures, picking at scraps. "Check this out," Rico crowed, holding up a gleaming watch he'd pulled from Daniel's wrist. The gold band caught the fading sunlight, glinting brightly against the grime of the alley. "Man's rocking some serious bling." Daniel lurched forward, his breath ragged. "Give that back." His voice cracked, but there was desperation behind it. Trey snatched the watch from Rico's hand, examining it with mock curiosity. "Damn, this thing's got some weight to it. Bet we could get a good price for this, huh?" "No!" Daniel's shout echoed off the walls. He pushed himself upright, wobbling but determined. "That's not just a watch. It belonged to my grandfather." Sean scoffed, stepping in front of Trey protectively. "Yeah? And what's that supposed to mean to us?" Daniel's chest heaved, his voice breaking. "Please, I'm begging you. Take the money. Take whatever you want. But leave the watch." "It's all I've got left of him." The gang erupted into laughter. Rico slapped his knee. "Man's getting all sentimental on us. You hear this, Trey?" Trey's smirk widened as he dangled the watch in front of Daniel just out of reach. "Aw, come on now. Don't make it personal. It's just a watch, right?" Daniel lunged for it, but Trey shoved him back with a single hand, sending him crashing into the wall. His head hit the bricks with a sickening thud, and he slumped to the ground, groaning. Andre's fists clenched tighter, his nails digging into his palms. He'd seen enough. Every second felt like a blade carving into his chest, cutting away the excuses he'd been telling himself. The laughter, the cruelty, the way Daniel's face twisted in pain. It all ignited something inside him that he couldn't suppress any longer. Trey held the watch up again, turning it over in his hand. "Looks like we've got ourselves a little souvenir, boys. Might just keep this one for myself." "Don't," Daniel rasped, his voice barely above a whisper. "Please." Andre stepped forward, his shadow stretching out onto the pavement. His voice rang out, sharp and commanding, cutting through the gang's laughter like a blade. "That's enough." The gang froze, their heads snapping toward the sound. Andre's figure emerged from the shadows, his face hard as stone, his posture rigid with purpose. Trey's smirk faltered, but only for a moment. "And who the hell are you supposed to be?" Andre's eyes locked on Trey, cold and unwavering. "I said, that's enough. Leave him alone." Trey's smirk returned as he turned his full attention to Andre. Behind him, Daniel slumped against the wall, groaning in pain as he struggled to stay conscious. The gang barely spared him a glance, their focus now on this new interruption. "Look at this guy," Rico sneered, sizing Andre up with a dismissive glance. "What are you even doing here, huh? Shouldn't you be digging through trash or something?" Sean chuckled, stepping closer. "Man's probably mad we're messing with his favorite donation spot. Sorry, old-timer, but this ain't your business." Andre's expression didn't waver, his gaze shifting briefly to Daniel before locking back on Trey. "You've had your fun. Walk away while you still can." That brought a round of laughter from the group. Rico nudged Sean, shaking his head. "This dude serious? Thinks he's gonna scare us off looking like that?" Trey tilted his head, the grin never leaving his face. "Man, I don't know who you think you are, but this ain't your fight. So why don't you turn around and go back to your little cardboard box?" Andre's hands unclenched slowly, his shoulders rolling back as he straightened his posture. His voice was calm, almost too calm. "Last warning. Leave. Now." The gang exchanged glances, and for a moment, Trey's grin faltered. There was something in Andre's tone, something unnervingly steady, but he pushed the thought aside. He waved a hand dismissively. "Get this guy out of here," Trey said to Rico and Sean. "Show him what happens when you don't mind your business." Rico moved first, lunging at Andre with an outstretched arm. Andre shifted his weight effortlessly, sidestepping the charge and driving a hard elbow into Rico's ribs. The sound of the impact was sharp, followed by Rico's grunt of pain as he stumbled back. "What the—" Sean started, but Andre was already moving. His fist connected with Sean's jaw in a clean, powerful arc, sending him reeling. Andre's movements were fluid, precise, his years of training surfacing like muscle memory. Trey cursed under his breath. "What are you idiots doing? Get him!" Rico recovered, charging again, this time with more aggression. Andre ducked under the swing of Rico's arm, stepping into his space and delivering a sharp uppercut to his chin. Rico staggered, collapsing to his knees, clutching his face. Sean came at him next, swinging wildly. Andre blocked the first strike with his forearm, countering with a palm strike to Sean's chest that knocked the wind out of him. Sean crumpled, gasping for air as he stumbled back into the wall. "Is that all you've got?" Andre said, his voice steady, eyes flicking between the remaining men. Trey's face darkened as he stepped forward, cracking his knuckles. "You think you're hot stuff, huh? 3-on-1, and you're still standing? Let's see how long that lasts." Andre stood his ground, his stance unwavering. His sharp, calculating gaze followed Trey's every movement as the gang leader circled him, looking for an opening. Trey threw a feint, then lunged with a quick jab. Andre leaned back just enough for the punch to miss, countering with a swift kick to Trey's knee. Trey grunted in pain, stumbling back, but recovering quickly. "Come on!" Trey barked, gesturing to the others. "Get up! We're not letting this bum take us down." Rico and Sean staggered back to their feet, flanking Andre as Trey advanced again. Andre took a deep breath, his body relaxed but ready, his focus razor-sharp. Andre's breathing was steady, but his muscles burned. Trey circled him like a wolf, his lips curling into a snarl. Rico and Sean flanked him, emboldened by Trey's command. They weren't done yet, and Andre knew it. "You ain't so tough now, are you?" Trey taunted, flexing his hands as he gestured for Rico to move in. 3-on-1, old man. Let's see how long you can keep this up." Andre pivoted on his heels, tracking their movements. Rico lunged first, throwing a wide punch. Andre deflected it with his forearm, but Sean was right behind him. A fist connected with Andre's side, the sharp pain forcing him to stumble back. Trey seized the moment, stepping in with a brutal hook that clipped Andre's jaw. His vision blurred as he staggered, barely regaining his footing before Rico swung again. This time, Andre wasn't fast enough. The punch landed squarely in his ribs, the air rushing out of his lungs. "You're slowing down," Sean jeered, throwing a kick that struck the back of Andre's knee. He dropped to the ground with a grunt, one hand pressing against the pavement for support. Andre rolled to avoid a stomp from Rico, using the momentum to push himself back to his feet. But his movements were slower now, his body already aching from the barrage of hits. Trey's laughter echoed in his ears as he braced himself for the next attack. Rico came at him with a wild swing, and Andre managed to dodge, countering with a quick jab to Rico's chest. It bought him a moment of breathing room, but Sean rushed in next. His fist connected with Andre's shoulder, the impact radiating pain down his arm. Andre bit back a groan, his vision narrowing as he tried to focus. His mind raced through scenarios, calculating his next move, but his body was screaming for relief. He could feel the fight slipping away, each strike chipping away at his defenses. "Not so cocky now, huh?" Trey sneered, stepping forward. His fist slammed into Andre's stomach, doubling him over. Before Andre could recover, Sean delivered a sharp elbow to his back, sending him sprawling to the ground. Andre gritted his teeth, his hands pressing against the cold pavement as he struggled to rise. Trey loomed over him, Rico and Sean flanking his sides. "Stay down, old man," Trey spat. "You're done." But before Trey could strike again, a voice broke through the chaos. "Get away from him!" Daniel's shout echoed down the alley, raw and determined. Trey turned, his smirk fading as Daniel stumbled toward them. Blood trickled from a cut above his brow, and he clutched his side, but his eyes burned with defiance. "I said, get away from him." Andre pushed himself up on one knee, glancing at Daniel. The man was battered, barely standing, but his presence was enough to shift the gang's focus for a moment. "You gotta be kidding me," Rico muttered, shaking his head. "This guy's back?" Daniel ignored him, stepping closer. "You want to fight?" he rasped. "You're gonna have to go through both of us." Andre forced himself to his feet, the pain in his body dulled by the surge of adrenaline. He stepped up beside Daniel, their backs almost touching as they squared off against the gang. "You should have stayed down," Andre muttered, his voice low but steady. Daniel gave a weak chuckle, his lips curling into a defiant grin. "Not really my style." Andre adjusted his stance, his fists rising as the gang hesitated, their confidence wavering. "Then let's finish this." Andre stood firm, his back lightly brushing against Daniel's as they squared off against Trey and his gang. The men circled cautiously now, their earlier cockiness replaced by frustration. Rico and Sean rubbed their bruises, glaring at Andre, while Trey's sharp eyes flicked between his crew and their opponents. "Two guys," Trey muttered, his voice dripping with contempt. "Two busted-up losers, and you still can't handle them?" Andre's gaze flicked toward Daniel, who was barely holding himself upright, but still clenched his fists. "We've handled worse," Andre said coldly. "You're just a bum," Rico snapped, stepping forward. "Look at you. Frail as hell. You're lucky you're even standing right now." Andre's jaw tightened, but he didn't respond. Instead, he let Rico's bravado guide him into making a mistake. Rico swung wildly, and Andre ducked, stepping inside his reach and slamming a fist into his ribs. Rico let out a pained grunt, stumbling back. "Stay down," Andre warned, his voice sharp and commanding. "Get up!" Trey barked at Rico, but before he could recover, Andre shifted toward Sean, who had darted forward. Sean's punch grazed Andre's shoulder, but Andre countered with a sharp uppercut to his jaw, sending Sean sprawling onto the pavement. Trey cursed, his hands balling into fists. "You think you're tough, huh?" He lunged at Andre with surprising speed, his punch aimed squarely at Andre's face. Andre sidestepped, grabbing Trey's arm and twisting it sharply. Trey yelled, his knees buckling as Andre forced him down. Daniel managed to move forward, throwing a clumsy punch at Rico, who was trying to rise again. The hit wasn't clean, but it was enough to send Rico back down with a groan. Daniel staggered but didn't fall, his breath ragged. Andre towered over Trey, who was now on his knees, clutching his twisted arm. Sean lay groaning a few feet away, while Rico barely moved, his face twisted in pain. Andre's steady, cold gaze swept over the three men. "Not so tough now," Andre said quietly, his voice laced with controlled fury. Trey gritted his teeth, glaring up at him. "This ain't over, old man." Andre leaned closer, his eyes narrowing. "If you come back, it will be." For a moment, silence settled over the alley, broken only by Daniel's labored breathing. Then, with a sudden burst of movement, Trey grabbed a handful of dirt and gravel from the ground, throwing it into Andre's face. Andre stumbled back, his vision blurring. "Now!" Trey shouted, scrambling to his feet. Rico and Sean moved quickly, using the distraction to pull themselves up. Sean shoved Daniel hard, sending him crashing back into the wall. Andre wiped at his eyes, clearing his vision just in time to see the gang retreating down the alley, their steps uneven but fast. Trey turned back briefly, his grin twisted. "Catch us next time, old man." Andre straightened, his body taut, but he didn't give chase. His eyes stayed on the shadows where they disappeared, his breathing steadying. "They ran," Daniel muttered, his voice tinged with disbelief. I thought we had them." Andre let out a slow breath, his fists relaxing at his sides. "We did. They just got lucky." Daniel leaned heavily against the wall, wiping blood from his brow. "You were incredible back there. I mean, you wiped the floor with them. But how? Who are you? Andre hesitated, his gaze still fixed on the mouth of the alley. He didn't look at Daniel as he spoke. Just someone who's had a lot of practice. Daniel frowned, his expression searching. That's not just practice. That's training. Real training. Andre finally turned to face him, his expression unreadable. You don't need to know my story. What you do need to know is that guys like them don't quit. They'll be back. Daniel nodded slowly, his lips pressing into a thin line. Then, we make sure we're ready. Andre's eyes flicked back to the shadows, his jaw tightening. Damn right. Andre leaned against the alley wall, his chest heaving as the adrenaline began to ebb. The sharp aches of his bruises and the dull throb in his ribs were setting in now, but he barely noticed. Beside him, Daniel collapsed onto a low stack of crates, pressing a hand to his side and wincing. Hell of a night, Daniel muttered, his voice thick with exhaustion, though a faint trace of humor lingered beneath the words. Andre glanced at him, his sharp gaze assessing Daniel's injuries. You'll live, he said plainly, though his tone softened just enough to make it clear he wasn't indifferent. You've got guts. Most people would have folded. Daniel huffed out a tired laugh, leaning forward with his elbows on his knees. Guts, stupidity. Sometimes hard to tell the difference. Andre allowed himself a faint smirk. Sometimes it's both. For a moment, the two sat in silence, the faint hum of the city filling the air. Andre let his gaze sweep across the alley, ensuring the gang was truly gone. His muscles remained taut, but for now, the danger seemed to have passed. You saved me, Daniel said suddenly, breaking the quiet. His tone was heavier now, the weight of the night sinking in. If you hadn't stepped in, I don't even want to think about what they would have done. Andre's eyes flicked to him briefly before returning to the alley. You held your own, he said simply, brushing off the praise. You weren't going to make it easy for them. Daniel shook his head, his voice firm. Don't downplay it. They were going to kill me, and we both know it. Andre didn't respond right away. His jaw tightened, and he looked away, his mind replaying the fight. You didn't deserve what they tried to do, he said quietly. No one does. Daniel exhaled slowly, his shoulders slumping. Still, thank you. I mean it. Andre nodded, the faintest sign of acknowledgement. You'd have done the same. Daniel chuckled weakly, rubbing the back of his neck. Not sure I'd have done it as well. The way you handled yourself back there, that wasn't just luck. You knew exactly what you were doing. Andre stiffened slightly, his face unreadable. I've had practice. Yeah, Daniel said, his brows furrowing. That much is obvious. You've been through some things, haven't you? Andre hesitated, his gaze shifting to the ground. Enough to know how to end a fight, he said finally, his voice low. Daniel studied him for a moment, then leaned back against the crates, wincing as he adjusted his posture. Look, I don't know what you've been through, and I'm not going to pry. But I know one thing. A guy like you shouldn't be out here. Andre's head tilted slightly, his eyes narrowing. What are you saying? Daniel straightened, his expression growing more resolute. I'm saying you deserve better than this. He gestured vaguely to the alley around them. Living out here, scraping by. That's not where you belong. Andre frowned, the words striking a chord he wasn't sure he wanted to acknowledge. It's not that simple. Maybe not, Daniel said, his tone softening. But I'm alive because of you. I owe you, and I don't like leaving debts unpaid. Andre folded his arms across his chest, his eyes narrowing slightly. I didn't help you for a payout. I know, Daniel said quickly, raising a hand. And that's exactly why I want to help you. Look, I own a chain of repair shops. I could use someone who knows how to handle tough situations. Someone reliable. Someone like you. Andre's brow furrowed as he studied Daniel, his face unreadable. You're offering me a job? Daniel shrugged, though the motion made him wince. Yeah. Call it gratitude, call it me wanting someone like you on my team. Either way, the offer's there. Andre didn't answer immediately, his mind racing. He hadn't expected this. Not tonight. Not ever. You don't even know me, he said finally, his voice quiet but firm. I know enough, Daniel replied. I know you didn't have to step in tonight, but you did. That tells me everything I need to know. Andre stared at him for a long moment, his expression softening just a fraction. You don't owe me anything. Maybe not, Daniel said, his tone lightening. But I want to do this. So, think about it. Andre nodded slowly, his gaze drifting back to the alley's entrance. I'll think about it. Daniel smiled faintly, leaning back with a sigh. Fair enough. Just don't take too long. Guys like Trey don't stay down for long. Andre's lips curled into a faint smirk. Neither do we. Andre glanced at the mouth of the alley, his sharp eyes scanning for any sign of the gang's return. The streets beyond were quiet now, the faint glow of streetlights casting long shadows over the pavement. Beside him, Daniel struggled to his feet, leaning heavily on the crates for support. You good to walk? Andre asked, his voice steady but laced with concern. Daniel nodded, though his wince betrayed the truth. Yeah, might take me a minute, but I'll make it. Andre stepped closer, offering an arm. Daniel hesitated for a moment before accepting the help, draping an arm over Andre's shoulder. Together, they began moving toward the main street, their steps slow and uneven. This shop of yours nearby? Andre asked, breaking the silence. Just a few blocks down, Daniel said, his voice strained but determined. I've got a first aid kit there. Should be enough to patch us up. Andre nodded, adjusting his pace to match Daniel's. The night air was cool against their skin, the quiet streets offering a strange sense of calm after the chaos of the alley. Neither of them spoke much as they walked, the unspoken weight of what had just happened settling over them. When they reached the shop, Daniel fumbled with his keys, his hands trembling slightly. Andre took the keys from him without a word, unlocking the door and pushing it open. The faint smell of oil and rubber greeted them, mingling with the metallic tang of tools and machinery. Daniel gestured toward a small office at the back of the shop. First aid kit's in there. Andre guided him to the office, helping him onto a worn leather chair before moving to the cabinet Daniel had pointed out. The kit was small but well stocked, a testament to the kind of work that went on in the shop. Let me see, Andre said, pulling out antiseptic and gauze. Daniel started to protest but stopped when Andre gave him a pointed look. Fine, he muttered, leaning back in the chair. But you're next, Andre snorted quietly. We'll see. He worked quickly, cleaning the cut on Daniel's brow and taping it up with practiced efficiency. Daniel hissed at the sting of the antiseptic, but stayed still, watching Andre with a curious expression. You've done this before, Daniel said after a moment. A lot, I'm guessing. Andre didn't look up, his hands steady as he secured the bandage. Enough times. Daniel studied him, the question hanging in the air between them. But this time, he didn't press. Instead, he offered a faint smile. Thanks, Andre nodded, stepping back. Your turn to sit still. Daniel chuckled weakly, his hand gesturing toward the chair. Fair's fair. Andre settled into the chair, and Daniel grabbed the kit, moving with deliberate care. His hands were slower, less certain, but he managed to clean the scrapes on Andre's knuckles and tape up a bruise on his shoulder. You've got a few more miles on you than I thought, Daniel said, his tone light but not mocking. Andre raised an eyebrow. That's supposed to be a compliment? Yeah, Daniel said, his grin widening. And I don't give those out often. Andre allowed a faint smirk to tug at his lips. Lucky me. They sat in silence for a while, the hum of the shop's old fluorescent lights filling the space. Daniel leaned back in his chair, letting out a slow breath. You know, he said, his tone thoughtful, You'd be good here. At the shop, I mean. I wasn't just talking earlier. Andre's brow furrowed slightly, his gaze shifting to the floor. I don't know if I'm cut out for that anymore. You're cut out for more than you think, Daniel said firmly. And we could use someone like you. These streets are rough, and having someone who knows how to handle themselves, it'd make a difference. Andre didn't respond immediately, his thoughts racing. He'd been drifting for so long, it felt strange to even consider staying in one place. But something about Daniel's words, about this shop, felt different. I'll think about it, Andre said finally, his voice quiet but sincere. Daniel smiled faintly, nodding. That's all I'm asking. Andre stood, testing his bandaged shoulder. You need rest. Both of us do. And we need to figure out what happens next. Daniel stood as well, his posture stiff but steady. Agreed. Because something tells me those guys aren't done. Andre's gaze darkened slightly, his expression hardening. They're not, but neither are we. Andre paced the shop floor, his hands resting on his hips as he surveyed the dimly lit space. The steady hum of the fluorescent lights overhead mixed with the faint metallic creak of machinery settling in the still air. Daniel leaned against the doorway to the office, watching Andre with an expression caught between gratitude and concern. You should stay here tonight, Daniel said, breaking the silence. His voice was calm, but carried a note of insistence. It's not much, but it's better than wherever else you've been sleeping. Andre stopped mid-step, turning to face him. His sharp gaze narrowed slightly, and he folded his arms across his chest. I'm fine, he said curtly. Daniel frowned, pushing off the door frame. No offense, but you don't look fine. You just took on 3 guys, got beat up in the process, and you're standing here pretending like you're bulletproof. Andre's jaw tightened, but he didn't respond immediately. His eyes flicked to the tools scattered across a nearby workbench, their orderliness betraying Daniel's meticulous nature. I've been worse off, he said finally, his tone flat. Daniel stepped closer, his voice softening. I don't doubt that. But you don't have to be tonight. The shop's safe. There's a cot in the back I used to crash on when I worked late. It's yours, if you want it. Andre hesitated, his arms tightening across his chest as if shielding himself from the offer. He wasn't used to this. Help, kindness, anything that required letting his guard down. Why do you care? Daniel's brows furrowed slightly, his tone steady. Because you saved my life, and because I've been where you are, not exactly, but close enough to know what it feels like to think no one gives a damn. Andre studied him for a long moment, the weight of the man's words pressing against the walls he'd built around himself. Finally, he let out a slow breath, his shoulders relaxing slightly. You're persistent. I'll give you that. Daniel chuckled, though the motion made him wince. That's what my wife used to say. A flicker of something passed through Andre's eyes, but it vanished as quickly as it came. Fine, he said, his voice resigned. I'll stay. Daniel smiled faintly, gesturing toward the back of the shop. Come on. It's nothing fancy, but it beats the pavement. Andre followed him through the cluttered shop, his footsteps echoing softly. The back room was small, with shelves stacked high with spare parts and tools. In one corner was an old cot, a folded blanket resting on top. Daniel motioned toward it. Make yourself at home. Bathroom's through that door if you need it. Andre nodded, stepping closer to the cot, but not sitting down. He stared at it for a moment, his thoughts swirling. I haven't slept in a real bed in a while. Daniel leaned against the doorway, watching him carefully. I don't know what you've been through, he said after a moment, his tone cautious. But I can see it's been a lot. Andre's shoulders stiffened, his back still to Daniel. You don't want to know, he said quietly. Maybe not, Daniel replied. But sometimes it helps to talk. Andre finally sat on the edge of the cot, his hands resting on his knees. He stared at the floor, his voice low and even. I've done things, bad things. Some I had to, some I didn't. And I've paid for it. Every damn day. Daniel didn't press, giving Andre the space to say as much or as little as he wanted. I thought maybe out here I could disappear, Andre continued, his voice barely above a whisper. But it doesn't matter where you go. The past doesn't stay buried. Daniel nodded slowly, his expression thoughtful. The past doesn't have to define you. Andre looked up at him, his eyes dark and guarded. It does, when it's all you've got. Daniel straightened, his tone firm but not unkind. Maybe it's time you had something else. Andre didn't respond, his gaze drifting back to the floor. The silence stretched, heavy, but not uncomfortable. I'll let you get some rest, Daniel said finally, turning toward the door. Lock up if you need to. We'll figure out the next steps in the morning. Andre nodded, pulling the blanket over his lap as Daniel left the room. The soft click of the door closing was followed by silence, save for the faint hum of the shop's lights. For the first time in what felt like years, Andre allowed himself to relax, his body sinking into the cot. Sleep came slowly, but when it did, it was deep and dreamless. Andre stirred awake to the faint creak of the shop door. His instincts sharpened instantly, his muscles tensing as his eyes adjusted to the pale morning light filtering through the small window. Sitting up quickly, he scanned the room, his body still coiled for action. Easy, came Daniel's familiar voice. He stepped into the room, holding 2 steaming cups of coffee. It's just me. Andre relaxed slightly, though his shoulders remained stiff. He rubbed the sleep from his eyes, still half-dazed from the first decent rest he'd had in months. What time is it? Early, Daniel replied, setting one of the cups on the small table by the cot. Thought you could use this. Andre nodded his thanks, wrapping his hands around the cup and letting the warmth sink into his skin. The bitterness of the coffee woke him further, grounding him in the moment. He glanced at Daniel, who looked tense despite his casual demeanor. You look like you've seen a ghost, Andre said, his sharp gaze narrowing slightly. Daniel hesitated, leaning against the doorframe. It's probably nothing, he said, though his tone betrayed the uncertainty in his words. Andre raised an eyebrow. What happened? Daniel sighed, running a hand through his hair. On my way here this morning, I got this feeling. Like someone was following me. Andre straightened, setting his cup down on the table. You're sure? Daniel shrugged, his hands gesturing vaguely. Not entirely. It was just, you know that sense you get when someone's watching you? I looked back a couple of times, but I didn't see anyone. Still, it didn't feel right. Andre's expression darkened, his jaw tightening as he processed the information. Could have been one of them. Trey and his guys like to size up their targets before they make a move. Daniel frowned, his arms crossing over his chest. You really think they'd try something again? After last night? Absolutely, Andre said firmly. They're pissed, and they've got something to prove. You humiliated them, and I made them look weak. They won't let that slide. Daniel let out a slow breath, his shoulders slumping slightly. Great. So now what? I can't keep looking over my shoulder every time I leave the house. You don't have a choice, Andre said, his tone calm but direct. Until this is over, you stay alert. If you think someone's following you again, don't lead them here or anywhere important. Stick to crowded places, take detours, and keep your phone on you at all times. Daniel nodded slowly, processing Andre's advice. All right, what about the shop? They know where it is. If they want to hit me where it hurts, this is the place they'll go. Andre leaned back, his fingers drumming lightly on the arm of the chair. That's why I'll stick around for now. Watch the area. Keep an eye out for anything suspicious. If they're planning something, they'll slip up. Daniel tilted his head, studying Andre. You're really willing to go this far. You've already done so much. Andre's lips pressed into a thin line. I don't like unfinished business. Trey's the type who thinks he owns these streets. If we don't stop him, he'll keep coming. Daniel nodded, his jaw tightening. Then we do this smart. I've got cameras around the shop. They're basic, but they work. Maybe we can catch something useful. Andre smirked faintly. Not bad. Daniel gave a small shrug, his expression grim. Learned the hard way. You don't last long in this neighborhood without being prepared. Andre stood, rolling his shoulders as he finished the last of his coffee. All right, let's check the footage and take a look around. If Trey's got someone watching you, we'll figure out who it is. Daniel straightened, his determination growing. Let's get to it. Together, they left the back room and moved into the main area of the shop. The space was bathed in soft morning light, the faint hum of machinery filling the air. Andre's eyes were sharp, scanning every corner for anything out of place. He could feel the tension in the air, the quiet before a storm. As Daniel set up the cameras to review the footage, Andre stood near the shop's entrance, his focus unwavering. Trey's gang was out there somewhere, and he knew they wouldn't wait long to strike. But this time, he and Daniel would be ready. Andre stood near the shop's entrance, his arms crossed as he stared out into the street. The morning sunlight bathed the pavement in a golden glow, but the quiet still felt uneasy. His instincts remained sharp, every small sound putting him on edge. Behind him, Daniel fiddled with the shop's security system, setting up the small monitor on the workbench. It's not the best setup, Daniel admitted, plugging in the last cable. But it's gotten me out of trouble before. Andre turned, stepping closer to examine the setup. The screen displayed several camera angles, the shop's entrance, the side alley, and a portion of the street out front. Better than nothing, Andre said, his voice calm but focused. Let's see what we've got. Daniel rewound the footage to the early morning, the time he'd left for the shop. The grainy black-and-white images flickered across the screen, showing Daniel walking down the street with his bag slung over his shoulder. At first, nothing seemed out of the ordinary, just a few passing cars and the occasional pedestrian. There, Andre said suddenly, pointing to the corner of the screen. A figure appeared briefly, stepping out from behind a parked car before ducking back into the shadows. Run that back. Daniel rewound the footage, freezing the frame where the figure appeared. The person was hooded, their features obscured, but their stance was unmistakable, deliberate, watchful. Daniel let out a low whistle. You were right. Someone was tailing me. Andre's eyes narrowed as he studied the screen. They're not amateurs. They stayed out of sight, but not enough. You probably spooked them when you looked back. Great, Daniel muttered, rubbing the back of his neck. So now what? They know where I work, and they're probably reporting back to Trey as we speak. Andre straightened, his expression hardening. We use it to our advantage. Daniel turned to him, his brow furrowing. What do you mean? Andre gestured toward the screen. If they're watching you, they'll assume you're an easy target. They don't know you've got someone watching your back now. Daniel nodded slowly, his mind working to keep up. So, we let them come to us? Exactly, Andre said, his tone firm. We prepare. If they make a move, we'll be ready. Daniel hesitated, his gaze flicking to the screen. And if they don't? If they're planning something bigger? Andre's jaw tightened. Then we go to them before they can pull it off. Daniel let out a slow breath, his hands resting on the edge of the workbench. You're sure about this? Andre met his gaze, his eyes steady and unyielding. If we don't act, they'll keep pushing. The longer we wait, the stronger their position gets. Daniel nodded, his determination returning. All right, but we need a plan, something solid. Andre smirked faintly. Already working on it. The two men spent the next hour going over the shop's layout and vulnerabilities. Daniel showed Andre the blind spots in the camera coverage, while Andre suggested ways to fortify the entrances. Together, they moved around the shop, testing locks and repositioning tools that could double as makeshift weapons. "You've done this before," Daniel said as they secured the back door. Andre shrugged, his expression unreadable. "I've picked up a few things along the way." Daniel didn't press further, sensing that Andre wasn't ready to share more. Instead, he focused on the task at hand. "If they come back, they'll probably hit us after dark. That's when they'll feel safest." Andre nodded. "Agreed. We'll need to stay ahead of them, anticipate their moves." Daniel glanced at him, a faint grin breaking through his seriousness. "You sure you don't want to run the shop? You'd make a hell of a manager." Andre snorted quietly, shaking his head. "Not my style." The moment of levity was brief but welcome, easing the tension between them. As they finished their preparations, Andre's sharp gaze lingered on the street outside. The morning might have been quiet, but he knew better than to trust the calm. "They'll come," Andre said quietly, more to himself than to Daniel. "And when they do, we'll be ready." The shop buzzed with activity as the morning shifted into full swing. The clang of tools, the hum of engines, and the chatter of customers created a lively symphony that filled the air. Andre stood near the entrance, arms crossed, watching the bustle with an air of quiet observation. "You planning to stand there all day? Or are you going to help out?" Daniel called from across the shop, a grin tugging at the corners of his mouth. Andre smirked faintly and stepped forward. "Just making sure no one's sneaking up on us," he said dryly, though there was a lighter note to his voice. Daniel chuckled, tossing him a grease-stained rag. "Well, how about you keep an eye on this carburetor while you're at it? Don't worry, I'll show you the ropes." Andre caught the rag with ease, moving to the workstation Daniel had pointed out. It wasn't long before another employee, a younger man named Pete, approached, his expression equal parts curious and skeptical. "You the new guy?" Pete asked, raising an eyebrow as he handed Andre a wrench. "Just helping out," Andre replied, his tone neutral as he studied the engine in front of him. Pete nodded, watching as Andre's hands moved with practiced precision. "You've done this before?" "Not exactly," Andre said, focusing on tightening a bolt. "But I've fixed things in my time." "Could have fooled me," Pete muttered, impressed despite himself. As the day went on, Andre found himself drawn into the rhythm of the shop. Customers came in with complaints, some straightforward, others more complex, and Andre stepped in where he could, offering a steady hand and a sharp eye. His calm demeanor and knack for problem-solving quickly caught the attention of both the employees and the customers. By midday, Daniel leaned against the counter, watching as Andre explained a repair to a customer with a level of confidence that belied his lack of formal experience. "You're a natural," Daniel said once the customer had left, shaking his head in disbelief. "You sure you haven't done this before?" Andre shrugged, wiping his hands on the rag. "Fixing things is just about understanding how they work, and how they break." Daniel smiled. "Well, you've got the touch. Customers love you." "Pete hasn't stopped talking about how you outpaced him this morning." "Maybe he needs to step up his game," Andre said with the faintest hint of a grin. The day continued in a blur of activity. Andre helped unload a delivery of parts, guided another employee through troubleshooting an engine issue, and even managed to charm a particularly difficult customer who'd been on the verge of storming out. By the time the sun dipped low in the sky, the shop was quieting down. Andre leaned against the counter, rolling his sore shoulders. His hands were smudged with grease, and his muscles ached from the physical labor. But for the first time in a long while, he didn't mind. "You did good today," Daniel said, walking up beside him. His voice was warm, genuinely appreciative. "The crew likes you. The customers like you. And judging by that look on your face, I'd say you even liked it. Andre glanced at him, his expression thoughtful. It wasn't bad, he admitted. Kept me busy. Daniel chuckled, patting him on the shoulder. That's the spirit. You know, if you ever want to make this a regular thing, the offer's still open. Andre didn't answer immediately, his gaze drifting toward the shop's open door. The faint sounds of the neighborhood filtered in, reminding him of the dangers still looming just beyond. We'll see, he said finally, his voice steady but non-committal. Daniel nodded, not pushing the point. Fair enough. Either way, I'm glad you were here today. Couldn't have done it without you. Andre's lips twitched into a faint smile. You'd have managed? Maybe, Daniel said with a grin. But it wouldn't have been as fun. As the last customer left, and the shop finally closed its doors, Andre found himself lingering near the counter. The day had been long, and the work had been demanding, but it had also been satisfying. For the first time in a long while, he felt like he'd done something worthwhile. The shop was quiet, its hum of activity replaced by the soft creaks and groans of the building settling into the night. Andre sat at the small table in the back room, a mug of reheated coffee in his hands. Across from him, Daniel leaned back in his chair, looking more relaxed than he had all day. You fit in better than I thought you would, Daniel said with a small smile. The guys already respect you, and I've got a feeling the customers will start asking for you by name soon. Andre shook his head, his lips twitching into a faint smirk. Don't get ahead of yourself. One day doesn't make me part of the crew. Daniel shrugged, his grin widening. You'd be surprised. Around here, loyalty isn't just about time. It's about showing up when it counts, and you've already done that more than once. Andre sipped his coffee, letting the words hang in the air. He wasn't used to hearing that kind of praise, and he wasn't sure what to make of it. We'll see, he said finally, his tone non-committal. Daniel nodded, standing and stretching. Well, I'm calling it a night. You good to stay here again? The cot's all yours. Andre hesitated, his gaze dropping to the mug in his hands. Yeah, he said after a moment. Appreciate it. Anytime, Daniel replied, heading toward the door. Get some rest. You've earned it. Andre stayed at the table for a while after Daniel left, his thoughts drifting. The day's work had left him feeling something. Not quite peace, but close enough to make him uncomfortable. He wasn't sure how to handle it. Eventually, he turned off the light and lay down on the cot. The blanket was scratchy, and the room was drafty, but sleep came easier than he expected. His body ached, but it was the kind of ache that came from honest work, and that was something he hadn't felt in a long time. Hours later, a sound jolted him awake. Andre's eyes snapped open, his senses immediately alert. He lay still, straining to hear. Faint voices drifted through the shop, low and muffled, but unmistakably there. Looks like the cameras are still up. We'll have to take those out first. Andre's muscles tensed. The voices were coming from outside, just beyond the shop's front door. He sat up silently, his movements careful and deliberate. Sliding out of bed, he moved toward the door of the back room, his bare feet making no noise on the cold floor. Think he's still here? Another voice asked, its tone wary. Probably, came the reply. Doesn't matter. We're just scoping the place tonight. Trey said we hit it tomorrow when it's empty. Andre's jaw tightened as he crept toward the front of the shop, his body moving instinctively, every step measured. Through the narrow window by the entrance, he could make out the silhouettes of two men lingering near the doorway. They were hunched, their gestures quick and furtive. What about the cameras? The first voice asked again. Relax, the second replied. We'll cut the power before we go in. Trey's got it all planned out. Andre's mind raced. He could wait, try to catch them off guard. But if they realized he was here, It might escalate into something worse. Instead, he decided to send a clear message. He reached over and flicked the light switch, flooding the shop with bright fluorescent light. The voices outside cut off immediately. Andre unlocked the front door with a deliberate click, opening it just enough to let them see his shadowed figure. His voice was low and calm, but it carried a sharp edge that cut through the silence. "If you're smart, you'll run. Now!" The two men froze, their eyes wide as they scrambled to process the sudden shift. "Shit," one of them muttered, backing away. "Let's go," the other hissed, tugging at his companion's arm. Andre stepped fully into the doorway, his imposing frame silhouetted by the shop's light. His gaze was cold, unyielding. "Tell Trey I'm waiting. And I'm not the patient type." The men didn't need any more convincing. They bolted, their footsteps echoing down the street as they disappeared into the night. Andre watched them go, his expression unreadable. Only when the silence returned did he step back inside, locking the door behind him. He stood there for a moment, his breathing steady as his adrenaline began to fade. Turning off the lights, he moved back to the cot, his mind already working through what needed to be done before morning. Morning light crept through the shop's narrow windows as Andre stood near the counter, his arms crossed and his expression grim. Daniel walked in, his movements slower than usual, rubbing the sleep from his eyes. He paused when he saw Andre's stance. "What's with the look?" Daniel asked, his voice still rough from sleep. "Something happen?" Andre nodded, his tone even but firm. "They were here last night." Daniel froze, his eyes widening. "What? Here? What did they do?" Andre gestured toward the shop's entrance. "They were scoping the place. Talking about cameras, cutting power, hitting us when the shop's empty. They ran when I turned the lights on and made it clear I wasn't going to let it slide." Daniel let out a low whistle, running a hand through his hair. "Damn. I didn't think they'd come back so soon." "They're not wasting time," Andre said, his voice calm but tense. "Trey's got a plan, and they're confident. We need to be ready." Daniel nodded, his expression hardening as he moved to the workbench. "All right. What do we do?" Andre stepped closer, his sharp eyes scanning the shop's layout. "First, we make sure they don't catch us off guard. Reinforce the doors and windows. Anything that slows them down gives us an advantage." Daniel grabbed a toolbox, pulling out a hammer and nails. "I've got some spare wood we can use for the windows. The doors are solid, but I'll check the locks just in case." "Good," Andre said. "We'll also need to adjust the cameras. Right now, they're easy to spot. Move them higher, out of reach, and angle them better to cover the entrances." Daniel set the tools down and gestured toward a ladder leaning against the wall. "There's a drill in the cabinet. I'll help you get those adjusted." Andre nodded, already moving toward the cabinet. "We'll also need a backup plan if they cut the power. Flashlights, battery-operated lights, whatever you've got." "I've got a few lanterns for emergencies," Daniel said, opening a storage bin and pulling them out. "They're bright enough to light up the whole shop." "Perfect," Andre said. "Set those up where we can grab them quickly." As they worked, the tension in the air was palpable, but productive. Andre moved with precision, his years of experience guiding his every action. Daniel followed his lead, his determination growing with every task. "So," Daniel said after a while, breaking the silence, "what's the plan when they show up? Just scare them off again?" Andre paused, tightening a bolt on one of the cameras. "No. This time, we make sure they understand they've crossed a line. But we do it smart. No unnecessary risks." Daniel frowned, leaning against the ladder as Andre adjusted the camera angle. "Smart doesn't always stop guys like Trey. They don't think like normal people." Andre's lips pressed into a thin line. "That's why we outthink them. They're used to people folding under pressure, not fighting back." Daniel nodded, his expression resolute. "All right. But if this goes sideways, We call the cops. Agreed? Andre hesitated, then gave a curt nod. Agreed. But we'll make sure they don't get a chance to do any real damage before that happens. They worked through the morning, reinforcing every vulnerable point in the shop. The cameras were repositioned, the windows secured, and the entrances fortified. By midday, the shop had transformed from a regular business into a defensible stronghold. Daniel stepped back, wiping sweat from his brow as he surveyed their work. Not bad for a couple of guys with no blueprint. Andre allowed a faint smirk. Not bad at all. As they finished setting up the last lantern, Daniel leaned against the counter, his expression thoughtful. You know, this isn't exactly how I pictured my week going. Andre chuckled softly. Yeah? How'd you picture it? Fixing cars, arguing with customers, and maybe catching a game on TV, Daniel said with a shrug. Not reinforcing my shop to fend off a gang. Andre's smirk faded slightly, his gaze steady. You're doing what needs to be done. Most people wouldn't. Daniel looked at him, his eyes narrowing slightly. What about you? You're doing more than I ever could have expected. Why? Andre's expression hardened, though his voice was calm. Because I've seen what happens when people like Trey think they can do whatever they want. And I've seen what it takes to stop them. Daniel nodded slowly, understanding the weight behind Andre's words. Well, I'm glad you're here. Couldn't do this without you. Andre didn't respond immediately, his gaze drifting toward the street outside. Let's just hope it's enough. The shop was eerily quiet as evening fell, the kind of silence that made every creak and rustle seem louder than it was. Andre sat near the counter, his back to the wall, his eyes fixed on the darkening street outside. Daniel paced the floor, his arms crossed tightly over his chest. How long do you think we've got? Daniel asked, his voice breaking the heavy quiet. Andre glanced at his watch, then back to the street. They'll come when they think no one's watching. Probably soon. Daniel let out a frustrated breath, shaking his head. I keep thinking about how this could all be avoided. I mean, we've got the cameras. We've got their faces. Can't we just call the cops now? Andre's jaw tightened. You could. They'd send someone out, take a report, maybe patrol the area for a day or two. But Trey and his guys would be back as soon as the heat died down. Daniel stopped pacing, leaning against the counter. So what? We just handle this ourselves? What's the point of having cops if they won't do anything until the damage is already done? Andre's eyes darkened, his voice steady, but edged with a quiet anger. That's how it works in places like this. Police only show up when there's a body on the ground or something they can slap on a headline. Daniel frowned, his frustration mounting. It's messed up. I pay my taxes. I built this shop from nothing. And now I'm supposed to just accept that I'm on my own? Andre didn't answer right away. His gaze focused on the shadows stretching across the street. You're not on your own, he said finally. Not tonight. Daniel glanced at him, his expression softening. Yeah. I guess I'm lucky you came along. Andre smirked faintly. You're lucky I don't sleep much. The brief levity eased some of the tension, but it didn't last. The two men fell back into silence, their nerves coiling tighter with every passing minute. Andre's posture remained rigid, his body alert and ready, while Daniel paced again, unable to keep still. What happens if this goes bad? Daniel asked suddenly, his voice quieter now. What if we can't stop them? Andre looked at him, his expression calm but resolute. We will. Daniel sighed, running a hand through his hair. I don't know how you stay so calm. I'm ready to crawl out of my skin. Andre's smirk returned, though it was tinged with something darker. You learn to push it down. Focus on what you can control. Daniel studied him for a moment, his brow furrowing. That's a lot easier said than done. It is, Andre admitted. But it's the only way you get through nights like this. Before Daniel could respond, Andre held up a hand, his head snapping toward the window. "They're here!" Daniel froze, his eyes widening as he moved closer to Andre. "You sure?" Andre nodded, gesturing for Daniel to stay low. He pointed toward the street, where shadows moved just beyond the range of the streetlights. Figures crept closer, their shapes barely visible against the darkened backdrop. "Trey and his guys," Andre said quietly. "Looks like 4 of them." Daniel crouched behind the counter, his breath coming faster. "What do we do?" Andre's voice was calm, controlled. "Stick to the plan. Stay low, stay quiet, and let them think they've got the upper hand. We'll hit them when they're least expecting it." Daniel nodded, though his hands trembled slightly as he gripped the edge of the counter. "Got it." Andre crouched as well, his sharp eyes fixed on the gang as they approached. The faint sound of their muffled laughter reached the shop, casual and cocky, as if they had already won. Trey walked at the front of the group, his swagger unmistakable even in the dim light. "They're confident," Andre murmured, his lips curling into a faint smirk. "That'll be their mistake." Daniel swallowed hard, his voice barely above a whisper. "You've got a plan for this, right?" Andre's gaze didn't waver from the figures outside. "Yeah. Just stick close and let me handle the heavy lifting." The sound of footsteps grew louder, the gang now just outside the shop. Andre's body tensed, every muscle ready to spring into action. He glanced at Daniel one last time, his voice steady and reassuring. "We've got this." Daniel nodded, taking a deep breath to steady himself. Together, they waited, the air thick with anticipation as the gang made their move. The shop was dimly lit, the overhead fluorescents turned off to keep the interior hidden from the street. Andre and Daniel crouched behind the counter, their bodies tense as they listened to the faint sounds of the gang breaking in. The quiet crack of the lock giving way was followed by the creak of the door swinging open. Andre's eyes narrowed as Trey and his crew filed in, their shadows long and jagged against the faint light spilling in from the street. Trey walked in first, his swaggering steps radiating confidence. Behind him, Rico and Sean carried crowbars, their postures loose but predatory. Dante lingered in the back, his head darting from side to side like a nervous bird. "All right," Trey muttered, his voice low but commanding. "Get to work. Cameras first, then anything that looks expensive." Rico nodded, gesturing to one of the walls. "I'll handle the cameras." Andre gave Daniel a quick, steadying glance. "Remember the plan," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "Stay low, and don't hesitate." Daniel nodded, clutching a wrench tightly in his hands. "Got it." The gang spread out, their footsteps echoing softly in the quiet shop. Trey stayed near the entrance, his knife glinting faintly as he flipped it open and closed, his smirk widening. "Told you this place was easy money," he muttered, mostly to himself. Andre waited until Rico was reaching for one of the cameras, his arm raised high with a crowbar. Then, in one fluid motion, he rose from his hiding spot and struck, his fist connected with Rico's ribs, the force sending the man staggering back with a loud grunt of pain. "What the hell?" Trey yelled, his knife snapping open as he spun toward the commotion. Daniel jumped up from behind the counter, swinging the wrench with both hands. The metallic clang echoed as it struck Sean's crowbar mid-swing, deflecting it and sending Sean reeling. Daniel pressed the advantage, shoving Sean hard into a nearby workbench. Dante froze, his eyes wide as he saw Andre advancing. I didn't sign up for this," he stammered, dropping his bag and stumbling toward the exit. "Then leave," Andre growled, his voice cold and commanding. Dante hesitated for a split second before bolting out the door, disappearing into the night. Rico, clutching his side, pulled out his phone with shaking hands. "We need backup," he gasped into the receiver. "Get here now." Andre's gaze snapped to Rico, his jaw tightening. "So much for keeping it fair." Trey sneered, stepping forward with his knife raised. "You think you're tough, old man? Let's see how tough you are when my boys show up." Andre didn't respond. Instead, he moved with lightning speed, closing the distance between them and knocking Trey's knife from his hand with a sharp strike to his wrist. Trey stumbled back, cursing, as Rico and Sean regrouped, both now armed with crowbars. The fight was only beginning, and Andre could hear the faint sound of approaching footsteps outside. "Daniel," Andre called, his voice sharp. "Get ready. This isn't over." Daniel gritted his teeth, his grip tightening on the wrench, as the two men prepared for the next wave. The odds were about to get worse. The sound of hurried footsteps echoed outside, growing louder as Rico's reinforcements approached. Inside, the chaos of the fight continued. Andre was locked in a brutal exchange with Trey and Rico, their crowbars swinging with sharp, metallic whooshes. Meanwhile, Daniel faced off against Sean, who grinned cruelly as he brandished a wrench he'd snatched from a workbench. "You really think you can take me?" Sean taunted, circling Daniel with a predator's swagger. "You're just a grease monkey playing hero." Daniel gritted his teeth, his mind racing. He couldn't match Andre's raw power or precision, but he didn't have to. The shop was his domain, and he knew every corner, every tool, every weakness. He just needed to play it smart. As Sean lunged, Daniel sidestepped, letting the wrench miss him by inches. "That all you got?" Daniel said, trying to keep his voice steady despite the adrenaline surging through him. Sean sneered. "I'm just getting started." Daniel led Sean further into the shop, maneuvering toward the rear where he'd been working earlier in the day. His eyes flicked toward the air compressor, a sturdy tool sitting near a loose coil of heavy-duty hoses. An idea sparked in his mind, and he shifted his stance, letting Sean think he was on the defensive. "Running already?" Sean jeered, advancing with another wild swing. Daniel ducked under the attack, his hands brushing against the coiled hose as he moved. "Not running," he muttered. "Just leading." Sean didn't catch the words. He pressed forward, closing the gap between them with reckless confidence. Daniel stepped back, his foot brushing against the air compressor pedal. He braced himself, grabbing the coil of hose with one hand while keeping the other near the compressor switch. As Sean swung again, Daniel twisted to the side, pulling the hose with him. The heavy coil tangled around Sean's legs, tripping him and sending him sprawling onto the concrete floor with a loud thud. "What the?" Sean sputtered, trying to free himself. Daniel didn't waste a second. He slammed his foot down on the compressor pedal, and a burst of air hissed through the hose. The pressure tightened the coils around Sean's legs, pinning him in place. Sean cursed, thrashing against the binding hose. "You're dead, grease monkey! You hear me?" Daniel stepped back, catching his breath as he grabbed a nearby wrench for defense. "Keep yelling," he said, his voice sharper now. "Maybe your friends will hear how bad you're losing." Sean growled, his hands clawing at the hose, but his struggles only tightened the coils further, leaving him immobilized. Daniel glanced toward the rest of the shop, where Andre was still fending off Trey and Rico. The sound of more footsteps outside signaled the arrival of the reinforcements Rico had called. Daniel's stomach sank, but he squared his shoulders, gripping the wrench tighter. "Andre!" he shouted, his voice cutting through the clamor. "We've got company!" Andre's eyes darted toward Daniel for a brief moment, his expression grim but resolute. "Stay sharp. We're not done yet." Daniel nodded, his breath steadying. He'd outsmarted one of them, but the fight was far from over. The shop was about to become a battlefield. The sound of pounding footsteps grew louder, echoing through the shop. Trey's reinforcements burst through the door, a trio of burly men who immediately sized up the scene. Their confidence was clear as they joined the fray, spreading out to corner Andre and Daniel. Andre stood near the center of the shop, his body coiled like a spring, his eyes sharp and calculating. His shirt was streaked with grease and sweat, but his stance was unwavering. The fight had ignited something in him, something he hadn't felt in years, a raw, primal focus. Rico smirked as one of the new arrivals, a tall man with a shaved head, stepped forward with a crowbar in hand. "Let's see how tough you are now, old man," Rico sneered. Andre's lips curled into a faint smirk, his voice steady and cold. "I've handled worse." The tall man lunged first, his crowbar slicing through the air. Andre moved instinctively, his body reacting faster than his thoughts. He sidestepped the swing and drove his elbow into the man's ribs, the impact reverberating with a sickening crack. The man let out a sharp grunt, stumbling back. Trey shouted orders, his voice laced with anger. "Don't just stand there! Take him down!" Two more men charged Andre simultaneously, one swinging a wrench while the other aimed a punch at his head. Andre ducked under the punch, grabbing the man's arm and twisting it with practiced precision. The man cried out as Andre slammed him into the wall, the force knocking over a set of tools. The second attacker came at him with the wrench, but Andre blocked the strike with his forearm, the pain barely registering. His other hand shot forward, landing a brutal punch to the man's stomach that left him gasping for air. Across the shop, Daniel was fending off another of Trey's crew, using his wrench to parry blows while trying to maintain his footing. "Andre!" he shouted, his voice strained. "Little help here?" Andre glanced over, his instincts taking in the entire battlefield. He grabbed a nearby tire iron, hurling it with precision. It struck the man Daniel was fighting in the leg, making him stumble. Daniel seized the opening, swinging his wrench and knocking the man's weapon from his hands. "Nice throw!" Daniel called, backing up toward Andre. Andre gave a curt nod, his focus returning to Trey and Rico, who were circling him warily now. "You've got good aim for a homeless guy," Rico said mockingly, though the nervous edge in his voice was clear. Andre's smirk widened, his voice calm but laced with confidence. "Amazing what a little food and rest can do." He flexed his hands, feeling the strength surging back into his body. "You boys picked the wrong night," Trey growled, stepping forward with a snarl. "We're not scared of you." "You should be," Andre said flatly. Trey lunged again, this time with renewed aggression. Andre met him head-on, blocking the initial strike and countering with a powerful kick to Trey's knee. The gang leader staggered, his balance faltering as Andre followed up with a hard elbow to his jaw. The tall man with the shaved head recovered and charged again, swinging wildly. Andre ducked and countered with a brutal uppercut, the force sending the man sprawling to the ground. "Stay down," Andre said, his tone leaving no room for argument. Meanwhile, Daniel had managed to disarm his opponent and used the edge of a workbench to pin the man against the wall. His chest heaved with exertion, but his determination didn't waver. "They're running out of guys," Daniel called, glancing at Andre. "Doesn't mean they're done," Andre replied, his voice steady as he stepped toward Trey, who was clutching his ribs and glaring daggers at him. Trey's got too much pride to walk away now. The gang leader spat blood onto the floor, his expression twisted with rage. "You think you've won? You don't know who you're messing with." Andre tilted his head slightly, his gaze cold and unyielding. "I don't care who you are. You've already lost." Trey hesitated for the first time, his bravado flickering as Andre took another step forward. Around them, the remaining gang members faltered, their earlier confidence shattered by the relentless assault. Andre's movements had grown sharper, faster, his instincts fully awakened. He could feel his strength returning, bolstered by the day's rest and the surge of adrenaline. For the first time in years, he felt like the man he used to be, a fighter, a protector. The brawl wasn't over yet, but the tide had turned. Andre and Daniel stood side by side, battered but unbroken, ready to finish what the gang had started. The shop was a battlefield. Tools and debris littered the floor, and the faint hum of the streetlights outside was barely audible over the sounds of the scuffle. But the tide had shifted. Andre and Daniel stood tall, their opponents battered and struggling to regain their footing. Andre delivered a sharp punch to Rico, sending him crashing against a stack of tires. The man groaned, clutching his ribs as he slumped to the ground, no longer able to fight. Trey swung wildly at Andre with a crowbar, but Andre sidestepped effortlessly, his movements precise and deliberate. With a powerful strike, Andre disarmed Trey, sending the crowbar clattering across the concrete floor. "Enough!" Andre growled, grabbing Trey by the front of his jacket and shoving him backward. Trey stumbled, tripping over his own feet and falling to the ground. Meanwhile, Daniel wrestled with one of the reinforcements, using his weight to pin the man against a workbench. With a grunt of effort, Daniel grabbed a nearby bungee cord and wrapped it around the man's wrists, securing him tightly. "Stay down!" Daniel snapped, stepping back to catch his breath. The remaining gang members hesitated, their earlier confidence completely shattered. One of them tried to dart for the exit, but Andre moved like lightning, intercepting him with a swift kick that sent him sprawling. The man groaned, his face pressed against the cold floor, as Andre grabbed a length of heavy-duty rope from a nearby shelf. "Tie them up," Andre called to Daniel, his voice firm but calm. Daniel nodded, grabbing more cords and ropes from the workbench. Together, they worked quickly, binding the gang members' hands and feet. Sean thrashed as Daniel secured him, his curses filling the air. "You're making a big mistake, grease monkey. Trey's got connections. You don't know who you're messing with." Daniel yanked the cord tighter, leaning close enough for Sean to hear his growl. "I know exactly who I'm messing with. A bunch of punks who think they can bully people into giving them what they want." Across the shop, Andre hauled Trey to his feet, his cold gaze locking onto the gang leader's furious glare. "You're done," Andre said quietly, his tone carrying the weight of finality. "You tried to take everything from him, and you failed." Trey spat at the ground, his face twisted with rage. "You think this is over? You think tying us up fixes anything?" Andre's expression didn't waver. "You're not walking away from this." One by one, the gang members were tied up and secured in a line near the shop's center. Andre and Daniel stood over them, their breathing heavy, but their postures strong. The shop was a mess, but they'd won, and the gang was defeated. Daniel wiped sweat from his brow, glancing at Andre. "Now what?" Andre crossed his arms, his sharp gaze sweeping over the subdued gang. "We call the cops." Daniel frowned slightly. "And if they don't show up?" "You said it yourself. They don't always care about places like this." Andre nodded, his jaw tightening. "They'll show up this time. They've got no choice. We've done all the work for them." Daniel grabbed his phone, his hands still trembling slightly as he dialed. As he explained the situation to the operator, Andre crouched in front of Trey, his voice low and icy. "You thought you could walk in here, take what you wanted, and walk away. That's not how it works." Trey glared at him, his bravado faltering. "You don't scare me." Andre smirked faintly, his voice even colder. "Good. Because the next people you'll have to deal with will be wearing badges." Trey's jaw clenched, but he didn't respond. Daniel hung up the phone, letting out a shaky breath. "They're sending a squad car." "Shouldn't be long." Andre stood, his focus returning to the group of subdued men. "Good. We'll keep watch until they get here." The two men stood together, side by side, as the adrenaline slowly began to fade. The shop was quiet again, save for the occasional groan from the tied-up gang members. Daniel glanced at Andre, a faint smile breaking through his exhaustion. "We did it." Andre nodded, his gaze still on the gang. "Yeah, we did." The faint wail of sirens pierced the still night, growing louder with each passing moment. Andre and Daniel stood by the counter, their eyes fixed on the shop's entrance. The gang members sat tied up in the center of the room, their expressions ranging from sullen to furious. "You really think the cops are gonna care?" Trey sneered, his voice dripping with defiance, despite the ropes binding his hands and feet. "They'll be on my side soon as they hear who I know." Daniel shot him a sharp glare, his grip tightening on the wrench still in his hand. "You've lost, Trey. Keep talking if it makes you feel better. But it won't change anything." Andre remained silent, his posture calm but commanding as he kept his gaze on the door. "Let them come," he said quietly, his voice steady. "We've got all the proof we need." The sirens grew louder until the flashing red and blue lights filled the windows. 2 squad cars pulled up to the curb, and a pair of officers stepped out, their hands hovering near their holsters as they approached the shop. Andre opened the door and stepped out onto the threshold, raising his hands to show he wasn't a threat. "It's handled," he said calmly. "They're tied up inside." The lead officer, a stocky man with a no-nonsense demeanor, stopped mid-stride, his sharp eyes narrowing as he looked at Daniel. Recognition dawned on his face. "Wait a second," he said, his voice tinged with curiosity. "Aren't you Daniel Cross? You're the owner of that high-end repair shop over in Hillside Heights, right?" Daniel hesitated for a moment before nodding. "Yeah, that's me." The officer frowned, his gaze flicking to the rundown shop behind him. "What are you doing here? You've got a place in one of the wealthiest neighborhoods in the city. Why stick around a spot like this?" Daniel straightened, his tone firm despite his exhaustion. "Because this is where I started, and because people here deserve the same service as the folks over there. I'm not about to abandon the community that gave me my first shot." The officer studied him for a moment, his frown softening into something more like respect. "Fair enough," he said. "All right, show us what we're dealing with." Andre stepped aside, letting the officers into the shop. Trey and his gang shifted uncomfortably as the officers approached, their earlier bravado beginning to waver. "You've got nothing on me," Trey spat, trying to muster his usual arrogance. "This is illegal, tying us up like this. I want a lawyer." The second officer, a younger man with a clipboard, smirked faintly as he began taking notes. "You'll get your lawyer down at the station. Right now, you're under arrest for breaking and entering, attempted theft, and assault." Trey's glare shifted between Andre and Daniel, his voice rising with desperation. "This isn't over. You hear me? You think you've won?" Andre stepped closer, his expression cold and steady. "It's over for you," he said quietly. "You messed with the wrong people." The officers began untying the gang members one by one, cuffing them securely before hauling them to their feet. Sean groaned as he was pulled up, his earlier confidence replaced by quiet resignation. "Man, Trey, this is all your fault." "Shut up," Trey snapped, his fury barely masking his fear. As the officers prepared to haul the gang to the squad cars, the lead officer turned back to Daniel. "We'll need statements from both of you at the station. You've done good work here. Honestly, most people wouldn't have stood up to guys like these." Daniel nodded, his posture relaxing slightly. "Just doing what needed to be done." The officer's gaze lingered on him for a moment. "It's not every day you see someone like you, someone who's made it, still fighting for the places they came from. The city could use more people like that." Daniel's lips twitched into a faint smile. "Thanks. But tonight, I couldn't have done it alone." The officer's gaze shifted to Andre, his brows raising slightly in acknowledgement. "You've got a hell of a friend here." Andre didn't respond immediately, his expression unreadable. "We did what we had to." With the gang loaded into the squad cars and the immediate danger past, the officers left a patrol unit to secure the scene. Andre and Daniel exchanged a glance, exhaustion etched into their faces, but a shared sense of accomplishment lingering between them. "You ready to head down there?" Daniel asked, his voice lighter now. Andre nodded. "Let's finish this." The squad car rumbled softly as it made its way through the quiet streets, the city lights casting faint reflections on the windows. Andre sat in the back seat next to Daniel, his posture relaxed, but his mind still alert. The adrenaline from the night's events hadn't completely worn off, and his sharp eyes occasionally flicked to the passing streets. Daniel leaned back against the seat, exhaling deeply. "Hell of a night," he muttered, his voice heavy with exhaustion but tinged with relief. Andre smirked faintly, folding his arms. "Not your usual work shift, huh?" Daniel chuckled dryly. "Not by a long shot." For a moment, the car was silent, the tension of the night ebbing slightly. But Andre's thoughts were sharp, replaying the conversation he'd overheard earlier between Daniel and the officer. He turned to Daniel, his brow furrowing slightly. "Hillside Heights, huh?" Andre said, his tone casual but pointed. Daniel glanced at him, his brows lifting slightly. "You caught that, huh?" Andre's expression didn't change. "Hard not to. You didn't mention before that you run shops in one of the wealthiest parts of the city." Daniel shrugged, a faint grin tugging at his lips. "Didn't think it mattered." "What difference does it make where I work?" Andre's gaze didn't waver. "It matters when someone like you sticks around a place like this. Most people would have cut ties and focused on the money." Daniel's grin faded slightly, his tone softening. "This shop's different. It's where I started. Back when I was broke and just trying to make something of myself. People here gave me a shot when no one else would. I'm not about to walk away from that." Andre leaned back, his expression contemplative. "Loyalty's rare these days. I'll give you that." Daniel tilted his head, studying Andre. "You sound like you know a thing or two about sticking around when it's hard." Andre didn't respond immediately, his gaze drifting to the window. "You do what you can with what you've got," he said finally, his voice low. Daniel nodded, letting the silence linger for a moment before speaking again. "I meant what I said earlier, you know." Andre turned to him, raising an eyebrow. "About what?" "The job," Daniel said simply. "You've got skills most people don't, and you've got the guts to back them up. I'd be an idiot not to want someone like you on my team." Andre smirked faintly. "You're persistent, I'll give you that." Daniel laughed softly. "It's how I've stayed in business." Andre's smirk faded as he considered the offer more seriously. "I don't know if I'm cut out for something like that. It's been a long time since I had stability." Daniel leaned forward slightly, his voice steady but sincere. "Stability's overrated. What matters is purpose. And you've got that. You just need the right place to use it." Andre studied him for a moment, his expression unreadable. "And you think that place is with you?" Daniel nodded without hesitation. "Yeah, I do." Andre didn't answer right away, his mind racing. He'd been drifting for so long, it was hard to imagine staying in one place, let alone working as part of something bigger. But Daniel's words stirred something in him, a faint but undeniable spark. "I'll think about it," Andre said finally, his voice quiet but sincere. Daniel smiled, leaning back again. "Fair enough. Just know the offer stands." The squad car pulled into the station parking lot, its tires crunching on the gravel. As they stepped out, the weight of the night's events lingered between them, but so did a sense of possibility. Together, they walked toward the station, ready to give their statements and face whatever came next. The fluorescent lights of the police station cast a stark glow over the small, sterile room where Andre and Daniel sat. Across from them, the lead officer tapped away at a keyboard, entering details from their statements. His partner leaned against the wall, reviewing the initial report. "You're lucky you were able to hold them off," the lead officer said, glancing up at them. "Most people wouldn't have made it through a situation like that." Daniel nodded, his voice steady despite the long night. "We didn't have much of a choice. It was either fight back or lose everything." The officer's gaze shifted to Andre, his expression thoughtful. You've got a military air about you. Former service? Andre's jaw tightened briefly before he gave a short nod. A while back. The officer's tone carried a note of respect. Well, it shows. The way you handled those guys, most civilians wouldn't know where to start. Andre didn't respond, his gaze fixed on the officer's notepad. The praise didn't sit right with him. He hadn't done it for recognition. He'd done it because someone needed to stand up, and Daniel couldn't do it alone. The officer wrapped up the report, sliding it into a file. That should cover it. We'll contact you if we need anything else, but with the footage and your statements, this case is pretty open and shut. Daniel let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. Thanks. Really? The officer nodded, his expression softening. We'll make sure those guys see some real consequences for this. In the meantime, try to get some rest. You've earned it. Andre and Daniel rose, nodding their thanks before making their way out of the station. The night air was cool and quiet, a stark contrast to the chaos they'd left behind just hours ago. As they climbed into Daniel's car, a heavy but comfortable silence settled between them. The drive back to the shop was uneventful, the city slowly stirring awake as dawn approached. When they pulled into the lot, Daniel parked and leaned back in his seat, letting out a tired laugh. "Home, sweet home," he said, his voice light despite his exhaustion. Andre smirked faintly, glancing at the shop. "You sure this place is worth all the trouble?" Daniel grinned. "You kidding? After tonight, it means more than ever." They stepped inside, the shop quiet and still. The mess from the fight remained, a grim reminder of what they'd endured. Daniel grabbed a broom and started sweeping, his movements slow but purposeful. Andre watched for a moment before picking up a toolbox and beginning to reorganize the scattered tools. The two worked in silence for a while, the shared effort grounding them. Finally, Daniel broke the quiet. "So," he said, not looking up from his task, "any thoughts about my offer?" Andre paused, resting a wrench on the workbench. "You're serious about this? A job and a place to stay?" "Dead serious," Daniel said, leaning on the broom handle. "You're good, Andre. Better than most of the guys I've hired, and I've only seen you work for a day. I don't care where you've been or what you've done. I care about what you can do now." Andre met his gaze, his expression unreadable. "I haven't had a place to call home in years." "Then maybe it's time you did," Daniel said simply. "You've already got what it takes. You just need somewhere to land." Andre's gaze drifted around the shop, taking in the familiar chaos of tools and machinery. The offer felt strange, too good to be true. But Daniel's sincerity was hard to ignore. After a long moment, Andre nodded. "All right, I'll give it a shot." Daniel's grin widened, his relief obvious. "You won't regret it. And trust me, it's not just a job. It's a chance to rebuild." Andre smirked faintly. "We'll see." As the first light of dawn crept through the shop's windows, the two men continued to clean, the weight of the night slowly lifting. For the first time in years, Andre felt a flicker of something he thought he'd lost. A sense of belonging. Months later, the shop buzzed with life on a bright afternoon, the steady rhythm of tools clanging against metal mixing with the hum of engines. Andre stood near the main workbench, tightening a bolt on a sleek sports car, his hands steady and precise. He worked with quiet confidence, his movements efficient and practiced. Across the shop, Daniel chatted with a customer, a wide smile on his face as he handed over a receipt. The shop was thriving, the bays filled with vehicles ranging from beat-up sedans to luxury imports. The energy in the air was a far cry from the chaos of the night, when Trey and his gang had tried to destroy everything. Andre finished his work and wiped his hands on a rag, glancing around. The place looked better than ever, cleaner, more organized, and bustling with activity. The team Daniel had assembled worked like a well-oiled machine, and Andre had quickly become a key part of it. Daniel approached, holding 2 bottles of water, and handed one to Andre. "You know," he said with a grin, "I think this place has never been busier. We've got people coming in from all over now." Andre smirked faintly, taking a sip of water. "Word gets around when you do good work." "That's not just on me," Daniel said, gesturing to the shop. "You've been a big part of it. Customers ask for you by name now." Andre shrugged, his smirk deepening. "Guess I'm not bad with my hands." Daniel laughed. Understatement of the year. Their moment was interrupted by the chime of the radio on the shop counter. One of the mechanics turned up the volume as a news segment began. The familiar voice of a local reporter filled the room. "In today's news," the reporter said, "a group of men responsible for a string of robberies and assaults, including the attempted break-in at a local repair shop months ago, have been sentenced to lengthy prison terms. The group's leader, identified as Trey Carson, received the maximum sentence for his role in orchestrating the crimes. Authorities credit the cooperation of the shop's staff for helping bring these individuals to justice." The shop fell silent as the team listened, their expressions a mix of satisfaction and relief. Daniel turned to Andre, a faint grin tugging at his lips. "Looks like it's official." "They're not getting out anytime soon." Andre nodded, his gaze steady. "Good. They deserve it." One of the younger mechanics spoke up, his voice tinged with admiration. "You guys really took them on yourselves that night, huh? That's badass." Daniel chuckled, shaking his head. "It wasn't about being badass. It was about protecting what matters." Andre's eyes softened slightly as he glanced around the shop. "And making sure people like that don't think they can walk all over everyone." The mechanic nodded, his respect clear. "Well, you guys are the real deal. Glad to be part of this team." Daniel clapped Andre on the shoulder, his smile warm. "We've come a long way, haven't we?" Andre allowed himself a small smile. "Yeah, feels good." The radio continued playing in the background, but the team quickly returned to their work, the energy in the shop buzzing with renewed purpose. Andre watched them for a moment, a quiet sense of pride settling in his chest. For the first time in years, he felt not just useful, but truly at home. Daniel leaned against the workbench, taking another sip of water. "So, what's next? You sticking around for the long haul?" Andre smirked, glancing at the sports car he'd just finished working on. "I've got nowhere else to be. And this works for now." Daniel grinned, his expression full of gratitude. "Glad to hear it. Here's to keeping this place thriving, and keeping trouble like that far away." Andre nodded, his gaze drifting to the open shop doors where sunlight streamed in. For the first time in a long time, he wasn't just surviving, he was building something worth fighting for. I hope you enjoyed that story. Please share it with your friends, and subscribe so that you do not miss out on the next one. In the meantime, I have handpicked 2 stories for you that I think you will enjoy. Have a great day!